The sound of the mop bucket hitting tile was the first thing anyone heard. It was a simple, ordinary slap, plastic against vinyl, that marked the end of a hallway and the beginning of a room where people who never touched a mop pretended not to notice the people who did. Bernard heard it and looked up. Alexandra Ashcroft was in the middle of a sentence that had been practiced 100 times, her voice smooth as polished wood. Sunlight came in through high panes, catching the gold in her watch and making the glassy table look like a stage. She was talking about growth, about margins, about a bold new pivot that would take Ashcroft Holdings into the $250,000 they had promised investors. People in the room leaned forward, phones were open, a few laughed, a few nodded. Bernard kept working. He moved with the economy of someone who did this every night: mop, ring, step forward, turn. His hands were big and familiar with the weight of things that needed carrying. Tonight, the building hummed with the kind of confident heat that belonged to people with secure paychecks and safe elevators. Bernard was the outline at the edge of it, janitor, after hours, invisible until something broke. A cough cut Alexandra off. It was a small sound at first, like a swallowed laugh. Then her face shifted. The practiced cadence snapped, her chin dropped, her shoulders went slack. A woman in the second row gasped. Someone reached for a glass of water. The room's breath hitched. Bernard heard that too. It wasn't the kind of noise the boardroom made when the quarterly projections went wrong. It was small and precise. It was the sound someone makes when their body tells them, in blunt and merciless terms, that something is very wrong. He dropped the mop. It hit the floor with a wet slap that sounded obscene in the quiet of the presentation. He ran. He had no right to run. There were protocols. There were security men whose job it was to cross a velvet rope. But a person is a person. Bernard shoved through a pair of glass doors and into a room that smelled of coffee and posture. People stepped back with the awkwardness of those who had been taught to stand aside for the powerful. Bernard didn't step aside. He planted himself by Alexandra's shoulders and did what any of those training videos he'd watched at the community center had taught him. "Call 911, he said, loud enough that 2 or 3 heads turned. "Open her airway." He did it with a mechanic's certainty. Fingers at the throat to sweep non-existent obstructions. Tilt the head. 2 firm breaths into warm skin that had gone very cold. The breaths were shallow spills at first. He pressed with the heel of his hands at the center of her chest and kept time with the pulse of his own fear. Push, release, push, release. He could hear his own breathing now, the hot, sharp sound of someone living too close to an ending. The room reduced to a narrow tunnel. A hand brushed his sleeve, someone from security. Bernard pushed it away. "I'm not done," he said. "Sir," the security guard mouthed, "you have to step back. You have to." But Bernard was not listening. The compressions had the clarity of work. Down, up, down, up. 2 rescue breaths. Compression, compression. The count in his head was a thin wire holding him to the moment. He felt the fragile give of another human chest beneath his palms, and imagined, ridiculously and stubbornly, the life inside like a match flame. Then a sound, a small, wet noise from Alexandra's throat. Her lashes fluttered, her lips parted, her eyes opened in a slow, startled way, as if a drawing had been erased and redrawn. Air found her. The room exhaled as one. "Thank God," someone said. And then the tape of polite applause that people use when they don't know what else to do, disjointed, awkward. Bernard stepped back. He'd done what he could. He wanted to wipe his hands on his jeans and go back to the mop he had abandoned at the door. Instead, hands closed around his arms. He heard a voice, crisp and officious, mansplained urgency. "Sir, please, security." It happened so fast that a few frames of it could be stitched into other meanings. A hand at Bernard's shoulder. Another pair of hands guiding his body away from Alexandra's. A photographer, someone who worked front of house or an intern with a phone, caught a moment. Bernard leaning forward, his mouth full of Alexandra's. A single grainy still. A smear to be born the moment the image met an eager imagination. They were already talking in the room about returning to business. A board director joked about caffeine. An assistant whispered into a phone. Someone wrote inappropriate in the margin, though no one had used the word yet. The man from security's jaw set like a hinge that had been bent for this purpose. Bernard was breathing. Alexandra was breathing. The tape of life had resumed. But once a picture exists, it no longer belongs only to those who made it. Before the night ended, before Bernard had finished his route, the phone calls came. A thin official voice from Human Resources read a letter's contents from the other end of a line. In light of recent reports concerning inappropriate conduct during company time, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Inappropriate conduct was a polite phrase with soft edges, but it carried the bluntness of a closing gate. The letter slid into his mailbox the next morning on cream paper with an embossed logo. Bernard sat at his small kitchen table and smoothed it with 2 fingers, as if one could flatten shame the way one flattens a creased bill. He folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept receipts and Molly's school pictures. The drawer smelled faintly of crayons. Molly's photograph, she was 6, dress smeared with paint, a gap-toothed grin, watched him from its corner. The same small, implacable proof that life went on whether the world recognized it or not. They were already talking in the room about returning to business. A board director joked about caffeine. An assistant whispered into a phone. Someone wrote inappropriate in the margin, though no one had used the word yet. The man from security's jaw set like a hinge that had been bent for this purpose. Bernard was breathing. Alexandra was breathing. The tape of life had resumed. But once a picture exists, it no longer belongs only to those who made it. Before the night ended, before Bernard had finished his route, the phone calls came. A thin official voice from Human Resources read a letter's contents from the other end of a line. In light of recent reports concerning inappropriate conduct during company time, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Inappropriate conduct was a polite phrase with soft edges, but it carried the bluntness of a closing gate. The letter slid into his mailbox the next morning on cream paper with an embossed logo. Bernard sat at his small kitchen table and smoothed it with 2 fingers, as if one could flatten shame the way one flattens a creased bill. He folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept receipts and Molly's school pictures. The drawer smelled faintly of crayons. Molly's photograph, she was 6, dress smeared with paint, a gap-toothed grin, watched him from its corner. The same small, implacable proof that life went on whether the world recognized it or not. Nobody in the boardroom had seen Bernard the way that photograph could be seen, clear, small, and precious. They had seen a blur in the periphery. They had seen an image that could be turned into a rumor, and a rumor into a campaign. By noon, the grainy still had found its way onto a local news feed and then into the wider churn. The headline read nothing factual. It asked a question instead. Unexpected kiss? And under it, a comment thread that was ready to be a verdict. The caption mocked the scene with a selfie's ignorance. 4 words had become an accusation. If you're following this story, subscribe to see how the truth unfolds, Bernard heard in his head. Something he read once in the dark on a friend's channel when he was killing time at night. It sounded ridiculous when he thought of his own life, as if the world had room to subscribe to him. He didn't say the line out loud. He thought it. That had to count for something. At home, Molly played with her teddy bear, brown felt worn thin at the nose, and asked why Daddy looked sad. She asked in a way that made sorrow into a toy. Bernard bent and put his forehead to hers and said what he had practiced in 1,000 parental crises. Everything's fine. Daddy's fine. We are okay. He told a small, true lie, because when you are responsible for a child, another kind of truth is required. Stability, a promise. Janet knocked on the door just after dinner. She lived a floor up, a woman whose hands smelled of soap and bread, who sometimes left soup outside their door when Bernard had worked a double. She had an armful of foil-wrapped sandwiches and a look at once practical and gentle. "I heard," she said without preface. "Honey, you did the right thing." Right meant different things in different rooms. In the boardroom, right had tight edges. In their building, right meant you protected people when they needed it. Bernard tried to explain the mechanics of what happened to people who kept changing the meaning of the scene. He could not explain to the strangers online who were already angrier than they were kind. He could not control the image that had become a weapon. The weeks that followed were a sequence of small humiliations. He applied for work at a grocery store and watched an application go in and a face go cold. He mopped at a school for a day and left early when parents recognized him and their children gave them the insistent look of someone whose teacher had told them to be suspicious. He printed out papers and circled job openings with a red pen until the ink bled. Each rejection was punctual and final. A neighbor's friend who had once nodded in the hallway now crossed to the other side of the street. The smear settled like a film over the city. It did not speak the truth. It need not. It only needed to be loud. Tyler Brigham, CFO, a man who wore ties like armor and had built his career avoiding messy human things, saw the image and felt something else. Not guilt, but calculation. For Tyler, the picture was a problem for the company, a leak to investors' nerves, a story opponents could twist. He convened a meeting with legal, with the VP of communications, and with a man who specialized in reputation restoration. Optics matter, Tyler said. It was not a sentence delivered for effect. It was more like weather reporting. We cannot allow this to define us. The board will expect action. His assistant sent out memos and tightened the language. Inappropriate conduct was a phrase she liked for its ability to carry enough ambiguity to be punitive while being short enough to be easily printed and filed. The company moved faster than it generally did. There was urgency in the choice to fire a man no one feared. There was a sense of containment, a soft wall built from a carefully chosen sentence. Bernard's phone rang constantly after the still was posted. Unknown numbers. A recorded voice asking if he wanted to clarify the comfortable contact seen in the photo. He hung up on the reporters who tried to make him small and loud at the same time. He stopped answering some calls. His mother said nothing when he told her. His sister sent emojis. He mopped other buildings for a few nights, at a mall that smelled of fried sugar and last-chance purchases. People did not speak to him, they only watched. He washed his hands until his skin flaked. The work that had once given him rhythm, mop, ring, sweep, had become a string of reasons he had to be away from home. At home, Molly asked if they'd have pancakes that weekend. He rolled his sleeves and searched the cabinet for pancake mix. There was less of everything. The rent was due, and the landlord's smile had a tiredness that made Bernard's chest ache. At night, he woke to the image of the boardroom still, a frozen moment that had become a verdict. He would close his eyes and see his palms on Alexandra's chest. He would think of the sound he had heard when her breath returned, the tiny human miracle that had nothing to do with policy. He had saved a life, and the consequence of doing so had been to lose the thing he'd had before, a small, predictable safety net. Meanwhile, inside glass and light, Alexandra sat at the top of a building that collected the city's shapes. She woke up in the night with a taste of iron at the back of her throat and went to the small dark where the security footage could be accessed. She had asked for a copy. She had been told she could not see it without sign-off, but she had also learned how to find people who owed her favors. Her hands hovered over a pause button, a frame that would define everything she could do or refuse to do. She had not watched the footage like a viewer. She watched like someone assembling evidence against a sliding scale of responsibility. The first frames were corporate mundanity, the glass doors, the polished floors, the audience arranged like a theater. Then the pivot. She watched her body go rigid, then soft. She watched, as though from a distance, the shape of someone's hands on her chest. The grainy still that had become an accusation on the internet existed. In glorified pixels, it betrayed nothing of intent. In the footage's moving pattern, she could see the sequence. Tilt the head, clear the airway, 2 breaths, compressions. She could hear, faint and swallowed in the file's cheap audio, someone say, "Call 911." She could see the security men cross, then take hold, then push another set of hands away. The decisive moment, which in public became a scandal, was a clean piece of medical action for breath and pulse. Alexandra paused on a frame where Bernard's face was bent close to hers. In the photo that had lived online, that had been rewritten into a narrative of impropriety, here, in motion, it was only the unfancy brutality of saving breath. She watched him draw 2 airways into her lungs with deliberate breaths. The man who had been erased by the outrage was suddenly just a person again, his jaw set in concentration, his hands honest. Guilt arrived without fanfare. It was not a blinding star so much as a weight that had been added to the space where she kept her sleep. She did what people in her position rarely did. She rewound the footage and played it again. She counted the compressions. She watched the emergency responders arrive and saw Bernard step back, allow professionals to take over. She saw the security hands at his arms. She saw the pause in the conversation where words had lost their function. Something in her clenched like a fist. She had been rescued. She had been returned to air by someone whose name she did not know. Someone had saved her without thinking about a resume or a suit. The return was an intimacy of the kind that makes a person small and grateful and unpleasantly indebted. She lifted her phone and typed a message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hit delete. She started again. She had counsel to consider, a brand to protect, a board to consult. She also had a loop of footage that refused to be simplified into a headline. Its insistence pressed against the cool contours of business decisions. In the weeks after the photo spread, press releases came from Ashcroft Holdings that were careful and precise. They expressed regret that the incident has caused concern and promised an internal review. They made no mention of gratitude. They made no mention of the man who had stepped in. The review, by design, would not be quick. It would not offer a human story. It would offer processes. At home, the children's teddy bear was a worn sentinel. Molly carried it to bed each night and brought it out in the morning like proof that something in the world was predictable and loving. When Bernard was at his lowest, Janet would sit and watch Molly braid the bear a scanty scarf and check the heater with an intuitive, tired kindness. She would bring older magazines and say, "You should rest. I'll make sure Molly does her homework." Bernard found himself thinking of small things to do with money he no longer had. He fixed the knob on the stove with a borrowed screwdriver because calling for service had become a luxury. He refused help when it stung too much. Better to be alone in dignity than accepted in a charity that said nothing about change. He scrubbed dishes until they were glassy and perfect, and waited for a time when his reputation would be, if not restored, then at least quiet. He would stand in lines and watch people who did not know him whisper. A child would point and a parent would pull them away. He tried to imagine the people in the boardroom hearing their own names in that same whispering way. He tried to imagine them feeling the slow grinding of isolation. It did not make the pain disappear. It only made him angrier and more tired in turns. Then one week, a rumor arrived that made the small fry of slander into something deeper. Someone claimed to have found a juvenile record in some archive. A photograph of a document surfaced on a blog that specialized in scandal. It had no author, and its chain of custody was a loose thing. The image was ancient and misaligned. It carried a narrative that demanded shame. Tyler visited the PR man who had been assigned the folder with the headline. "We need a narrative," he said, both irritated and panicked. "Something that doesn't leave this open." The PR man nodded. He had a stack of lines about upholding professional standards and protecting the integrity of our workplace. He knew how to make a company look like it cared, without having to do the messy work of reform. Tyler liked that. It was neat. It required little attention and no change. Outside of that machinery, Bernard was slowly unspooling. Days of cold walks, evenings of undercooked pasta, nights where he fell asleep on the couch with the television drone as companion. Sometimes with Molly's stuffed bear pressed to his chest because it smelled like her hair, and that gave a kind of solace no money could buy. He didn't see a doctor because where would he put the bill? And besides, the thing that was wrong with him felt less like an illness and more like the slow erosion of being seen. Janet would bring him soup and ask if he had eaten. He would say yes, because she could not fix everything, and saying otherwise would invite a truth they both were not ready to hold. One Saturday, he walked to a job fair in a community center 3 stops from his neighborhood. He'd spent the week printing copies of a resume he had edited for the umpteenth time. He dressed in his only dress shirt, one he reserved for funerals and graduations and other events where dignity was required. The fair was crowded with people sliding pamphlets into bags and recruiters practicing smiles. Bernard waited in line, and when it was his turn, he offered handshake and breath and a clear, concise explanation of his experience. "We're looking for managerial candidates," the recruiter said, one eyebrow lifted in a way he'd learned to read as "not you." Bernard smiled and shook hands and left with a pamphlet about a training program that required experience he did not have and a phone number he was not sure he wanted to call. He walked home across a city that had never looked so indifferent. The sun was low and the cold bit into his lungs like a warning. He had expected to feel tired. He had not expected the sharpness, the sudden dimming at the edges of his vision, the feel of his knees, not answering his instructions. He sat on a stoop to gather himself. A man on a bicycle offered a nod. A dog barked. The world kept moving in ways that did not wait for people to refuse to be swallowed by rumor. The next breath came too fast, and then stopped. Bernard's knees gave. He felt the floor press into his palms, the city tilting. He thought, absurdly and clearly, of Molly's teddy bear staring from its shelf. He thought of the termination letter in the drawer. He thought, for a sliver of time, of the boardroom light and the way Alexandra's hand had found air like a tide. His throat searched for the sound that had once been a sound of rescue. He wanted, with a child's simplicity, someone to say his name and tell him that he had done right. He did not pass out slowly. He went down with the kind of suddenness that surprised the world into a quicker attention. People nearest him called out. A woman kneeled and held his head. Someone else pushed a bottle of water into his clasped fingers. Bernard's breath came in jagged, unsteady pieces. A passerby with an EMT patch on his backpack checked for a pulse and said, "We need an ambulance." The siren took its time. It threaded through streets that were busy and indifferent. Bernard's chest rose and fell. He thought of Molly sleeping in their small apartment, of Janet's steady hands, of a world that had judged him on a single frame. He thought of the man who had watched the footage and shifted something inside himself, an admission perhaps, or the first edge of responsibility. On a high floor of glass not far away, Alexandra watched a pixelated loop of her own near death. She paused it at the instant Bernard had bent forward. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and for once the world of to-do lists and shareholder letters did not matter. Her phone vibrated. It was an assistant reminding her of a speech she had to make. She silenced it. She should have stayed where she was. She did not. She called security and asked not for a copy of the file, but for help in finding the man in the footage. She asked for a name. She was told it had been scrubbed in the rush to limit corporate liability. She heard the polite corporate language as if it were a foreign tongue. A secretary took a breath and said something like, "Mr. Kellerman's details were forwarded to HR." A wrongness settled somewhere in her chest.
It was not only about damage control or brand. It was about the human equation that corporate policy likes to tidy away. Guilt accumulates quietly, and then one day it is heavy enough to change the direction of someone who has always been able to point things. At the bottom of the city, an ambulance pulled up to the curb. The EMTs moved with the economy of people accustomed with rupture. They checked Bernard's airways, found a pulse that was thin, and sent instructions into the little network that saves lives when the call gets answered. They loaded him on a stretcher into the back of the vehicle with care and speed. Molly's teddy, which had been left on the bed, watched the hallway like a small mute witness. Janet sat in the waiting room when someone had called and said there had been an incident. She had the sense to sit with a coat wrapped around her knees. She would be a reliable relay for Molly. She would be the person who could get to the hospital at odd hours and bring soup that was warm and bland and full of the exact sort of comfort money rarely buys. The emergency room was bright and bland and intentionally impersonal. Lights hummed. A nurse's voice checked vitals and asked questions Bernard could not always answer. Any chronic illnesses? Do you currently use medication? Bernard's answers were a series of short syllables that meant yes in the general sense and I don't in the specifics. He had no continuity of care because his job had been erased by a headline and a photograph. He had no insurance that would cover a long stay. He had only himself and the thin web of people who believed him. As they wheeled him through the sliding doors, a familiar hum of corporate life rose in the city again, carrying with it a news ticker and an aftertaste of scandal. Somewhere along the line, someone took a photograph of the stretcher, an image of a man on the way to being named by strangers, and it went up blinkingly, hungry for clicks. Alexandra had watched the footage again and again. This time she did more than pause. She forwarded bits of it to a number she had on standby for crises. She wrote in plain, short sentences, "Find him. Now." Her message went into the network of people she had cultivated. Assistants who owned favors, private guards with lists, a woman in legal who had a way into records when record-keeping had been sloppy. She did not yet know what she would say when she found him. She only knew that she had watched someone save her life and then watched that person be erased with a polite phrase. That did not sit well with her. It did not sit well with the small, inconvenient truth that sometimes the right thing is not a careful process, but a swift one. At his lowest, Bernard held a sheet in the emergency room and watched the ceiling tiles go by like a static, patient sky. He thought of what he had done and how quickly the world had reminded him that saving someone could be punished.
The recollection felt urgent, like a debt that was not financial and yet demanded repayment. She arrived with shoes that didn't scuff and a jacket that hung like a curtain. She left both in a coat room as if they were props. Inside the emergency waiting area, she waited like anyone waiting, with a small, focused impatience and a captive sense of the moment's moral weight. The lights were too bright, the carpet too cheap. It was a place that made people ordinary in a way her offices never did. Janet was already there when Alexandra walked in, wrapped in a coat that smelled faintly of yeast in the day. When her eyes registered Alexandra, she did the practical thing she'd always done. She stood up, smoothing the hem of her skirt with hands that had smoothed diapers and curtains and stretch marks. The two women were from different economies, yet both had the immediate translator of human worry. "You must be Miss Ashcroft," Janet said. It was not a question. It was the way the world introduced itself when a billion-dollar name stepped into a hospital lobby. Alexandra sat without ceremony. She did not reach for portfolio or talking points. "I watched the footage," she said, as if that explained anything. I want to do what I can." Janet kept her eyes on Alexandra's face. There was no wide-eyed gratitude there, only a practical expectation. "He saved her life," Janet said. "If you want to help him, you can help him with things that don't make noise." Those things were exactly what Alexandra had not considered until then. A rent check that kept water running, a doctor who'd follow up beyond triage, childcare that did not require a second mortgage. She had never, in the clean architecture of boardrooms, considered the cumulative cost of being seen wrong for a man like Bernard. She had seen brand damage and reputational risk. She had not seen bruised ribs of dignity. When she walked into Bernard's room, she recognized the quiet geometry of someone suffering a private collapse. He lay propped on pillows, eyes rimmed with fatigue, a hospital gown that didn't fit him properly, his hands large and calloused, the knuckles paler than the skin. A paper bracelet looped his wrist. He watched her for a second as though trying to place whether she was part of the dream or the interruption that followed it. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, and the voice she used was not corporate. It was small and careful. I'm Alexandra Ashcroft." His mouth made a thin line. He had been practicing skepticism. It served him like armor. "You must have the wrong man," he said. His voice was rough like a broom handle rubbed raw. She unfastened a corner of a small envelope and pulled out a business card like a peace offering. I watched the footage. She did not preface with apologies. She had practiced sentences in private and discovered they were insufficient. "You saved my life." His eyes moved past the card to her hands.
The hospital lights softened some of the sharpness that living under glass gave her. Bernard rolled a shoulder. "People do what they can," he said. Inside that sentence were years of rules about humility and not taking favors you couldn't repay. "I don't want to be performative," Alexandra said. "I want to make sure you and your daughter are cared for, immediately. Housing, medical bills covered, and, if you'll consider it, I'd like you to help us design a program for employees who need the same kind of support." He blinked. That last bit sounded like PR vocabulary. It sounded like a script that would not include him. His lips tightened. "You want me to come work for the same people who fired me?" "I want you to come work with me," she said, "not as a mascot, as someone who knows what needs to be fixed, not tokenized, paid, with decision-making authority." Bernard's first instinct was to refuse. He had never liked being a spectacle. He had hired himself out to dignity, odd jobs that paid cash, labor that was steady and discreet. The idea of walking back into a building that had pronounced him deviant made his gut tighten. He pictured the boardroom's lights, the hush, the grainy still. He pictured being the subject of internet cruelty. He remembered the way reporters had called and called. But he also pictured something else: Molly's cough, the hole in the apartment's roof when it wintered, Janet's casseroles, the small, exhausting arithmetic of survival. He could see the toll it took on Molly's face, an echo of his own quiet resignation. "I don't want charity," he said. It wasn't a moral argument so much as a fact of what sustained him. "I don't want to be paraded. I don't want my daughter to think I sold us out." Alexandra nodded as though she'd been given a map. "Then let's make it work your way," she said. "I'll notarize a statement that what happened was life-saving. It will be public, we'll make sure it's on record. I'll arrange housing and medical care without strings. And the job, if you accept, will have a budget and staff. You will not be alone. You will be the leader." When she said leader, the word landed differently than when it was used in board reports. For Bernard, it meant responsibility, not spectacle. For the first time since the grainy still had made him a caricature, someone was offering the opposite: recognition with resources. The next week was a blur of practicalities that blinked like a bureaucratic sun. A lawyer called to arrange the notarized statement. Alexandra signed it in a private room with an assistant, and the paper read like a medical account. On date, Bernard James Kellerman performed emergency CPR on Miss Alexandra Ashcroft, resulting in the restoration of respiration prior to EMS arrival. No criminal action reported. Mr. Kellerman acted in good faith in the course of rendering life-saving assistance. It was precise, it was official. It would not erase rumor, but it would be difficult for an employer's HR department to contest without producing more damning evidence than a blurry photograph. She also, more immediately, put a payment on hold at a property management company. The apartment arrangement that Alexandra offered was small by her standards, a 2-bedroom above a bakery in a neighborhood with a park and a corner store. But to Bernard, it was an impossible amplitude of safety: dry floors, a door that closed without a draft, a landlord who had meet and greet coffee with tenants. The movers came with quiet efficiency and a stack of boxes labeled Kellerman, priority. Molly's stuffed bear rode on top of a stack like a flag.
Janet organized the packing like a field commander. She had a list and a pencil and pockets full of good intentions. She also had the key to the new apartment and the knowledge of how to explain things to Molly in a voice that did not let the child see the cracks. "Are you sure about this?" Janet asked Bernard when he stood in the doorway of the new place and watched sunlight cut across laminate. "You don't have to jump into anything you don't want to." Bernard looked at the bear, at the little chalk smudges on a wall where someone had practiced letters. He remembered the office tile against his knee as he had pushed down with his hands to compress a chest that had stopped. He thought of the nights he had slept on the couch with the television murmuring and his daughter curled at his side like a small compass. He felt the edges of fatigue and gratitude brush against one another. "I'll try it," he said. It was an understatement. It was also a commitment, not dramatic, not flashy, but the sort of small promise that builds around a kitchen table. The note Alexandra had notarized circulated quickly through legal channels and into the hands of the communications team. It was a useful document. It showed facts and removed ambiguity. For Bernard, it meant that the first public instrument of his vindication existed. For Tyler Brigham, it meant a new problem. A man who had previously been dismissed as a reputational risk now had documentation that made the company's reaction look callous. Tyler's reaction was not monstrous, it was strategic. He saw variables and risk curves. He saw investors who would worry and a board that liked low-variance decisions. He convened his circle of advisors and presented a plan he called containment. It was the same language he'd used before. A reroute, a narrative, the discipline of silence. He instructed legal to prepare statements that emphasized protocol and to fortify the image of a company that had acted decisively by terminating a staff member who had, in their calculation, created a scene. But the world Tyler wanted to control was less controllable than spreadsheets. Notarized statements were not the only currency of opinion. Anonymous accounts circulated. The internet had a long memory and a short attention span, but it also was iterative. Rumor bred rumor and let small grievances mutate into larger narratives. The image of the unexpected kiss refused to die quietly. Tyler pushed further. He authorized a reputational audit, a polite euphemism that included digging through databases and archives for anything that could throw Bernard back into shadow. One of the contractors Tyler hired had a history of operating at the slippery edges of ethics, scraping public records, pulling juvenile archives, tracing social media footprints. He forwarded a file with a red flag, an old seal on a courthouse scan, a name that matched, a date. It was the kind of thing that, unsigned, would hint at a blemish and not provide a context that could redeem it. The leak arrived like a small storm. A photograph of a typed piece of paper, grainy and framed with a blogger's flourish, suggested there had been an incident in Bernard's past that implied character flaws. It did not explain, because the image could not be explained without context, but it was enough. Clicks amalgamate into meaning for those who want to see a simple storyline. Hero becomes suspect. Bernard watched the new wave cresting and felt the old tightness in his chest return. He thought of the notarized statement and the new apartment, and he feared that both might be washed away by another rumor. He had no legal team. He had one woman, Janet, and a small growing network of people who had witnessed the truth and wanted to help. He had an assistant from Alexandra's side who visited sometimes, a woman named Fiona who kept a calendar and a list and who delivered small things as if she were grafting ordinary kindness into an impossible situation. Alexandra, for her part, grew more involved than she had planned. Her presence was not performative. She insisted on a small staff to carry out the task she had set. A pilot program that would offer rent assistance, childcare vouchers, predictable scheduling, paid sick days, and mental health counseling to frontline and low-wage employees of Ashcroft Holdings. She appointed Bernard as a consultant, and then, gently, persistently, asked him to be the pilot's public face if he felt comfortable. He refused at first. He wanted to build rather than be built into a story. "I don't want to be a poster boy," he told her, over lukewarm hospital coffee that had been reheated twice. "People like me get used for headlines." Then don't be a headline, Alexandra said. Be a person who decides what a program looks like. You will sign off on who sits on the advisory board. You'll have veto power. No smiling portraits unless you want them. She negotiated budget lines like someone opening a new type of ledger. Personnel, outreach, measurable outcomes. For him, she insisted on funding for legal defense to counter future unlawful leaks.
For him, she insisted on honest numbers and external validators, a community partner, a local nonprofit that understood the terrain of worker support. Bernard found himself in meetings with HR directors and social workers, and, on occasion, with Tyler, who looked at the budget lines with a hardness that hinted at his deeper discomfort. Change scares people who manage risk. Tyler resisted in ways that were, for him, familiar. He argued that a pilot of this nature could damage investor confidence. He worried about expectations that could not be met and the politics of scale. When Alexandra pushed back, he worked the media's edges. What if the program made Ashcroft look weak? What if competitors saw an opening? It was, again, calculation, not evil so much as a reflexive survival of an institutional mind. Meanwhile, life settled into a new, fragile rhythm in Bernard's home. Molly learned a new route to school. She kept her teddy in the same place on the bed. Janet checked in with muffins and a razor-sharp eye for detail. The apartment smelled like baking and paint. Bernard slept better some nights. He was still careful with trust. He remained guarded about the kindness that had toppled into his life, constant vigilance threaded with genuine, awkward gratitude. The smear did not die. It evolved. Someone with a talent for ruin harvested Old Town records and social media and constructed a narrative that suggested more than it proved. A drunken account, a misread court stamp, an anonymous comment. These were the raw materials of contemporary rumor. The story migrated from a local blog to a city paper and then to a national aggregator hungry for sensation. Tyler watched the metrics climb and felt the cold calculus of damage, and he decided, too late, that the strategy of silence would not suffice. He commissioned a firm to manage the narrative, which in practice meant hiring flattering op-eds and planting pieces sympathetic to the company's tough but fair stance. Alexandra would not tolerate either erasure or pander. She told Tyler to stop. He bristled. "This is not about stubbornness," he said one afternoon in a conference room with windows that showed cranes moving across the skyline. "It's about fiduciary responsibility." "Sometimes fiduciary responsibility looks like people," Alexandra answered, and it was a sentence that made the room tilt. Tyler's mouth went thin. He liked the shape of numbers more than the weight of people, and exposing that preference as a moral failing made him uncomfortable in a way that the spreadsheet never did. The moment the campaign escalated, the pain shifted back onto Bernard. Someone dug up a juvenile incident from decades ago that had no legal consequence, but that, in the hands of malicious editors, suggested a pattern. The post spread. Hate comments poured in. People who had no context for his life reached for the easy story. If you see a blurred photograph, trust your intuition. The internet's instincts are not nuanced. Bernard felt the old panic begin to braid itself into his bones. He could have disappeared into shame. Instead, he found a different route: transparency. He called a meeting at the local community center and invited anyone who had a microphone. He met with reporters on his own terms. He told his truth not as confession but as reality. "I was trained at a community center for basic CPR. I did what I saw. I have no criminal record that would affect my ability to help a child or a coworker. I have a daughter I'm responsible for. If you want to twist a picture into a story that makes me seem less than human, go ahead. But you'll have to make your case against these facts." His voice was quieter than the online frenzy. It was steadier. He did not declaim. He stated. He produced the notarized statement. He produced a list of witnesses, security officers who had been present, an EMT who had been called and whose notes corroborated the emergency. He asked to speak at a town hall meeting at Ashcroft Holdings. Alexandra agreed. The day of the staff meeting was raw. The building's atrium held employees from every tier.
Aides, janitors, executive assistants, analysts. Cameras had been invited as part of a transparency request. Tyler worried about turnouts and questions. Alexandra arranged the seating so that the lower-wage staff, his peers, saw he had a platform. Bernard stood before the employees in a way he had not planned. He had learned to move through rooms by cleaning them, not by commanding them. Now he faced people with a microphone, and his hands did not know what to do. He thought of Molly and tugged at the hem of his shirt until his fingers found the rhythm of their own nervous energy. "When I walked into that room," he began, and his voice found a surprising steadiness, "it wasn't a performance. It was a person on the floor. There was air and there was no air. I did what we teach people when they don't know how else to fix a thing." He did not use the word hero. He didn't need to. He spoke about being invisible. He spoke about the small wages and the impossible schedules that strip dignity. He did not ask for pity. He asked for understanding. He asked the company to think about what it meant to have employees whose lives tip from stability to ruin on the word of strangers. Tyler's people had prepared questions designed to corner him, about past records, about judgment, about motives. Bernard anticipated the barbs. When a screen in the back of the hall flashed a composite of headlines that had accused him, he paused and then reached into his own history with a measured honesty. "In my 20s, I made mistakes," he said. "I got into trouble. I paid the price and moved on. If you want to judge someone's whole life by one moment a paper found from 20 years ago, you'll miss the work someone did with a child in their arms. You'll miss what people do when they are asked to show up." Tyler's people had prepared questions designed to corner him, about past records, about judgment, about motives. Bernard anticipated the barbs. When a screen in the back of the hall flashed a composite of headlines that had accused him, he paused and then reached into his own history with a measured honesty. "In my 20s, I made mistakes," he said. "I got into trouble. I paid the price and moved on. If you want to judge someone's whole life by one moment a paper found from 20 years ago, you'll miss the work someone did with a child in their arms. You'll miss what people do when they are asked to show up." He did not lay blame at the feet of individuals in the room. He accused structures. He named the culture that prized optics over care. He did not demand vengeance. He demanded the dignity to be seen as a whole person. The room held its breath. A manager who supervised night cleaning handed her mop to a colleague and stood up. "He saved our CEO," she said. "He saved a human. We work alongside these people. We see them. We owe them a system that sees them back." A slow tide of hands rose, from administrators, from clerical staff, from security guards who had seen the footage and who remembered the moment with the same blunt clarity that Bernard had. The company had to decide whether it would continue to hide behind sanitized memos or step into real work. Alexandra listened. Tyler watched. Somewhere in that exchange was the hinge of a real change. The pilot program moved from proposal to approved in iterative stages, a 3-site pilot with clear metrics. The first was a food service team in a satellite office. The second was cleaning staff at 3 campuses. The third encompassed entry-level associates in distribution centers. Each site would be evaluated by independent auditors. Each would have a community partner. The budget was not vast, but it was a start. The pilot's early months were messy. People forgot to file forms, managers misinterpreted the policy about schedule guarantees. Some employees feared retaliation for asking for help. Bernard's role was not ceremonial. He spent long days listening to grievances and longer nights drafting policy with a team of HR folks who had never had to deal with the practicalities of a worker who couldn't miss a shift because a single absence meant rent was late. They set up a rent assistance fund with strict but humane criteria. They offered childcare vouchers redeemable at community centers. They created a hotline staffed by counselors familiar with regional needs. They tested flexible scheduling pilots that allowed workers to request guaranteed windows for childcare and schooling. They started a small training fund for promotion pathways.
The first reports trickled in like small good news. Absenteeism dropped in pilot sites, turnover decreased. An employee who'd previously left for greener pastures stayed and applied for a promotion with the help of training funds. A parent who'd been juggling 3 jobs took a sick day for their child and did not fear immediate reprisal. These results were not miraculous, they were modest and measurable. They were, however, the kind of evidence that slowly changes conversations. But Tyler was not done. He employed a more insidious tactic: narrative seeding. He leaked an internal email, edited and truncated, to a columnist who liked controversies. The email suggested Alexandra's motives were PR-driven and that the pilot was a brand repair exercise. The leak implied that money for the program had strings, contractual incentives for loyalty, not genuine reform.
Alexandra's defenders called it cynical. Her critics called it confirmation. Bernard watched these exchanges and felt himself pulled between the temptation to be silent and the desire to speak. He had come to understand that change requires narrative, not the one that shapes social media, but the one told in staff rooms and living rooms where people live their lives. He asked Alexandra to let the pilot's data speak and insisted on transparency. All program outcomes would be reported publicly, audited by community partners. The fight moved into public space when a small, influential podcast picked up the leak and framed it as yet another example of corporate co-optation. Tyler's counter-narrative, tight, numbers-based, failed to quell the suspicion that money from the top would always come with invisible shackles. It was time, Alexandra decided, for a different kind of answer. She arranged for a public forum at a small auditorium near one of the pilot sites. The event was modest by corporate standards. No banners, no press release. It was an open mic. The program would present early data and allow workers to speak. Bernard would introduce it. On the night of the forum, the room smelled of old varnish and coffee. Folding chairs lined the floor. A projector hummed. People in uniforms sat next to city residents. A few journalists stood at the back with notebooks. Bernard walked up to the microphone, straightened his back, and for the first time in months, he did not feel like a man under a microscope. He had prepared nothing more than the truth. "This isn't about Alexandra being saved," he said. "It's about the idea that saving someone isn't supposed to cost you your living." He told the room about the EMT notes and the notarized statement and the nights he had spent applying for jobs. He told them that being fired for doing right is an all-too-common cost in a system where power can rewrite facts. Then he stepped aside and let others speak. A mother in the front row testified about the childcare vouchers and the relief it brought. A night shift cleaner described how scheduling predictability allowed him to enroll in a GED class. The pilot's first metrics glowed on the screen. A 12% reduction in turnover at pilot sites, 20% fewer unplanned absences among those enrolled in the scheduling guarantees, and early signs of promotion among participants. It was not a revolution, it was a start. When the forum ended, cameras crowded the doorway. The headlines would not be kind in every corner. Some op-eds would complain about corporate virtue signaling. Others would highlight the facts and human stories. The leak would continue to sting, but the factual record, the auditing reports, and the community partner validations made it harder to sustain a smear campaign that, if anything, had to contend with a growing body of evidence. Tyler's tactics shifted again, this time into a legal maneuver. He attempted to control internal memos and limit Alexandra's unilateral moves by invoking governance procedures. The board would have to be consulted. Contracts had to be restructured. It was slow, lawful friction. Alexandra bristled at the delay, but worked within the channels. She learned from Bernard how to be patient in a way that still moved things forward. Meanwhile, Bernard's life outside the pilot steadied. Molly's cough subsided, she made friends in a nearby school, and brought home an art project of a son with too many rays. Janet recovered from a minor surgery and celebrated with a thrift shop dress and too much lemon cake. The apartment warmed with the smell of bread and the light falling across the bear's patched nose. For the first time in months, Bernard felt a margin of calm at the edges of his days. But public vindication is never total.
Small pockets of rancor lingered online. Anonymous commenters doubled down. Someone forged a screenshot of a private message and posted it in a way that implied exploitation. The false screenshot spread through darker corners of the net. Legal teams sent cease and desists. Volunteers in the pilot's community partner network ran listening sessions to counteract misinformation. The work became partly about data and partly about stories. A turning point came when a National Labor and Justice Conference announced a slot for a panel on equitable workplaces. Alexandra's PR team offered the panel as a corporate showcase. Others saw the chance to shift the narrative. Bernard was invited to speak not as a token but as an example of worker-led change. It was a remarkable inversion. The man once photographed and condemned to infamy for performing life-saving breaths would now address hundreds of people about dignity at work. The day before the conference, Bernard sat in a small, quiet hotel room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He practiced his remarks not as a speech but as a series of truths he had lived. He thought about the long, slow mechanics of change, meetings, missteps, victories that were hard-won and small. He thought about Tyler and the fear that had driven him to salvage a brand at any cost. He thought about Alexandra's rare admission of responsibility and her willingness to be in public alongside the people affected by the company's policies. He thought of Molly and took out his phone to watch a video of her dancing in the kitchen, her braids swinging, her laugh spilling like sunlight. He realized, with a tenderness that surprised him, that the work he was doing was not for recognition. It was for his daughter. The conference center smelled like coffee and paper. The hall filled with people wearing badges and hope on their sleeves. When Bernard walked onto the stage, he did not feel small. He felt like someone who had been given a platform to widen a conversation. He spoke with a clarity that had been hard-earned. "I didn't do this for praise," he told the audience.
"I did it because someone needed air." Later, the world tried to turn that into something else. But here's what matters. People who do the work deserve systems that protect them. We built a pilot that did practical things: rent help, childcare, reliable schedules, and the outcomes were real. Not perfect, not complete, but real. He told the story of a single mother who used childcare vouchers to take a second job and finish a certification. He told the story of a night cleaner who had been offered promotion after a year of training funds. He did not soften the flaws of the program. He admitted where they had failed. Forms that were hard to access, managers who lacked training, policies that in practice still favored those who could navigate the system. He finished with a simple ask: see people, say their names, build systems that make room for them to keep living while they work. This is not generosity. It's decency. The audience responded in ways that surprised him. Applause that built into standing ovation. Journalists scribbled and asked questions. Panelists nodded. The narrative shifted in subtle ways. The conference coverage spoke of worker-led design and measurable outcomes, phrases that translated into funders paying attention and a few companies reaching out to ask how to pilot similar programs. Back home, the program's dashboard continued to populate with small, concrete metrics. The Rent Assistance Fund had helped 27 households in the first 6 months. The scheduling pilot had cut childcare-related absences by 18% at 2 sites, and a steady 9% of frontline employees reported feeling more secure in their roles. None of that erased the smear, but it made it harder for cynicism to dominate the entire story. Tyler's role mutated into something else. He had not been malicious in a cartoon sense. He had been someone for whom risk management was a life skill. The entire episode forced him to reckon with a moral discomfort he had kept professionalized. In private, he argued the merits of tight governance and cautious rollouts. In a quiet meeting, Alexandra told him she was not interested in playing defense for a system that had failed people. "We can be careful and caring," she said. "You don't have to choose between them." Tyler took his pause like a man learning a new posture. He tightened contract clauses in ways that made the company accountable instead of evasive, insisting on independent audits and stakeholder input. He did not lose his hard edges. He learned to let some of them dull. Not everyone reached reconciliation. Lives had been bruised. News cycles moved on. But there were other things, family dinners, school plays, a landlord's smile, that stitched back into place. Bernard found a rhythm of purpose and exhaustion. He still scrubbed floors on occasion because he liked work that had an end and a visible result.
He still used a red pen to circle job listings for friends who were not yet ready to step into a program of their own. In the quiet months that followed, the pilot's model was shared with several other companies who came with lawyers and spreadsheets and a genuine curiosity. Replication required adaptation. What worked in one region did not automatically translate everywhere. But the conversations had shifted. People spoke about schedule stability and childcare as basic elements of workforce planning, not as fringe perks. The press cycle that had centered on the unexpected kiss dissolved into longer profiles and, finally, to a steadier beat of outcomes. The grainy still existed somewhere on the internet, but it lost centrality as other facts gained purchase. Bernard's name began to appear not as a scandal, but as an example. He felt strange at times seeing profiles and photographs, an odd mix of vindication and embarrassment. He preferred to be the man who worked late, not the man whose story had gone viral. He kept his routine, picking Molly up from school, checking the pantry, teaching her how to do laundry without breaking shirts. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived at their apartment addressed to Bernard. Inside was a letter from a group representing janitors in another city. "Your voice gave us someplace to start," it read. "Will you come and speak at our meeting?" He hesitated, not because he was unwilling, but because the act of traveling and having a microphone again felt weighty. He called Molly into the living room and showed her the envelope. She climbed into his lap and draped the bear over her knee. "If you go," she said simply, "tell them the part about the bear." He laughed and promised he would. The work had become part of his identity, but no longer its totality. He took weekend shifts teaching basic CPR at the community center, the same place he'd learned the steps. He taught people like him, neighbors, parents, teenagers, how to roll ahead and breathe into someone who had stopped. It felt like coming full circle. The man who had been judged for saving a life now taught others to save lives. Janet's life also found more stability. She took a part-time job at the community center, where her practical kindness became institutionalized in the form of a meal program. She had a steady schedule, and sometimes she came by the kitchen table with a bag of bread that made the apartment smell like celebration. The program expanded its staff. Bernard recruited people who had lived its problems: a childcare coordinator, a scheduling officer, a benefits navigator. They built an employee advisory board where frontline workers had a real vote. The pilot's audit included testimonials. Small budgets funded small miracles. A young man who needed a ride to an interview got voucher reimbursement. A woman who needed to enroll in college had childcare arranged during class times.
There were obstacles. A manager who refused to implement the scheduling pilot in a particular site, citing operational constraints. A rumor that resurfaced and required a legal reply. A journalist who wrote a piece arguing the program was insufficient for systemic poverty. Each obstacle required a different response: dialogue, policy tweaks, transparency, and occasional blunt truth-telling. The narrative's final large test arrived when a conservative blogger unearthed the edited email Tyler had thought sealed and used it to argue the pilot was manipulative. The piece spread fast. This time, Bernard did not retreat. He went on local radio, spoke plainly, and invited a reporter into the advisory board meeting where workers hashed out the nitty-gritty. The reporter stayed for hours and wrote a piece that focused on a single mother's relief when she could finally take a day off to see a doctor without losing wages. In time, the headlines grew kinder. The company released its first public report on the pilot. The metrics were modest but real, and the auditing partner validated the methodology. Alexandra appeared in a short video with Bernard and several frontline workers, not in a studio but in a small community center, sharing the stage to talk about next steps.
The video had no polish and therefore felt authentic. The day the program's pilot reached a milestone, 1 year of operation, Alexandra invited Bernard, Molly, Janet, and a handful of pilot participants to the company's smaller boardroom. They were not there to celebrate a brand win. They were there to mark the first year of a system that had, in a sliver of the company's reach, reduced precarity for a number of households. A small cake with 1 year scrawled in icing was set out. Molly pressed her face against the glass and laughed. Bernard felt a pride that was warm and uncomplicated, not the dizzy, headline-making pride of fame, but the kind that comes from having bread and from knowing your child will sleep through a storm without the roof leaking. "What about the program spreading?" Janet asked, wiping icing off her finger with a practiced hand. "We're sharing the model," Alexandra said, "with real partners and real accountability. It won't fix everything, but it will help, and we'll keep learning." Outside, the city pulled itself up and shaped itself around 1,000 small decisions. Inside the room, people laughed and told stories about the pilot's little victories. A manager who learned to block hours on a schedule so a parent could always pick up their child, a nurse who found affordable counseling for an employee, a janitor who completed a certificate with the help of training funds. Bernard looked at the group and felt, as if for the first time in a year, the absence of the heavy film that had once coated his life. There were still noises, the odd commentator, the lingering rumor, but they were background now, not the main thing.
When he returned home that evening, Molly tugged him by the sleeve and climbed onto his lap. She wanted him to read a book she had brought home from school, a picture book about a city where people helped each other. He read it aloud, the words melting into the kind of ordinary joy that had been absent for too long. On the balcony, the city lights twinkled like a constellated ledger. Bernard watched delivery trucks pass and the distant silhouette of cranes. He felt the weight of choices he'd made. To step into a room, to let a billionaire see a man, to sign up for a job that was messy and bureaucratic in equal parts. He thought of the long road ahead. The program would need funding, governance, and constant vigilance against backsliding. There would be legal battles and bad headlines, and the small daily grind of policy implementation. But there were also names on a dashboard, employees who had been helped, with first names and neighborhoods, small things that glowed like checkboxes on a form. He scrolled and counted and inhaled the night air that smelled faintly of frying onions and rain on concrete. Alexandra called that night. "How's Molly?" she asked. "She's good," he said. "She says you saved her bear." They both laughed, briefly, in a way that stitched two lives that had once been linked by a single event into something more durable. "You did the hard work," Alexandra said. "You did what people don't see." "It was what anyone would do," Bernard answered. "But thanks for making sure anyone who does that now has a safety net." They did not need a ceremony. They had reports and mattresses and more complex things like accountability structures and a community advisory board. But they also had small quotidian matters, school plays, dentist appointments, a landlord who now accepted online payments without shame. In the months that followed, other companies reached out. Some implemented half measures and retreated. Others partnered in ways that felt sincere, adopting scheduling guidelines or childcare stipends. The pilot's data provided evidence for conversations that had previously been mostly moral appeals. Numbers and human stories worked together to build will. At home, Molly slept with the bear at her side, its fur threadbare from love. Bernard tucked a blank notebook in his drawer and used it to jot ideas for scaling programs. Checklists for manager training, templates for rent assistance criteria, language for worker protections. He kept the red pen for corrections and the habit of circling things that mattered. One evening, as twilight folded into night, Bernard stood on the balcony and watched a woman down the street wave at her neighbor. A cab honked. The city did not become kinder because one program existed. It grew by one small, stubborn law of accumulative acts. When someone refuses to let a person be erased, it creates ripples.
He thought of all the small people he had learned to watch more closely: the janitors, the nannies, the assistants, the night shift workers who moved like ghosts through office towers. He thought about how visible they had been in a moment of crisis, and invisible again in the convenience of daily operations. That contradiction had become the engine of his work. When he tucked Molly into bed that night, he kissed her forehead. She grinned sleepily and said, "Daddy, you saved someone." "You saved me too," he answered, not referring only to the incident in the boardroom, but to the salvaging that came later. Someone who had refused to let his life be defined by a viral picture. He had been saved by a web of small mercies: an envelope of housing keys, a notarized line on cream paper, a woman who used her power to do a stubbornly human thing. In the months that turned and the seasons that shifted, the unexpected kiss lived on as a phrase, an image that had once been misread. But the misreading had catalyzed a series of choices that slowly nudged institutional behavior. The phrase reframed itself in time. People began to remember not the scandal, but the fact that someone had breathed into someone else and kept them alive. They remembered, if they chose to, that visibility is a choice, and that responsibility could be demanded from the top. On a small stage at a community center on a weekday afternoon, Bernard stood to teach CPR to a group of teenagers. He showed them the steps: call 911, tilt the head, 2 breaths, compressions at the center of the chest, rhythm and steadiness. He used plain language and the sort of patience that works with people who are anxious about being helpless. When a girl in the group raised her hand and asked what to do if they were afraid of being blamed, he answered with the same honesty he'd used before. "You're doing what's human," he said. "Tell someone, get help, say their name. Don't let a picture do your thinking for you." She nodded like someone getting a map. The city outside the door carried on: cars, deliveries, the constant business of life. The program's dashboard glowed in the background on a small monitor. Months later, at a community meeting, a woman stood up and said, "Because of this, I didn't lose my apartment." Another woman said her child no longer missed school because of a last-minute schedule change. Small things that equal dignity stacked together like planks making a bridge. At night, Bernard sometimes scrolled through comments left under op-eds or forum posts. There would always be someone determined to reduce human complexity to a headline. But there were also messages that read like postcards: "Thank you, we can breathe." On the anniversary of the boardroom incident, Bernard went back to the building, not to sweep, but to meet a team evaluating the next phase of the pilot. He walked the halls with a mop tucked in the corner of his mind, a symbol of the life he had before and the work he did now. He passed the place where he had bent and breathed and saw the polished floors and the brass plates and a security guard who nodded in recognition. Outside, he stood with Molly by his side. She held the teddy bear. He put an arm around her. The city spread beyond them, raw, noisy, beautiful in its indifference and its capacity for care. "Who do we see tomorrow?" he asked her. She thought like a child chooses answers, out of impulse and fairness. "Everyone," she said at once. He laughed and pulled her close. On his phone, the program's dashboard flashed a small set of numbers: the number of people helped, the percent of reduced turnover, the list of partners. None of it was a climax, none of it a miracle. It was a ledger of choices. He had been misread in a single grainy still. He had been fired, humiliated, and then given a chance to rebuild not only his life, but the structure around which other lives might be steadied. He had not been offered a Hollywood reversal. He had been given something quieter and truer: participation in the making of a system that could reduce the chances another man would be erased for doing what the human thing demands. When the program reached another milestone and the national press ran profiles, the headlines varied. Some still focused on the phrase that had started everything. But in comment sections and in community rooms across the region, people told a different story. One that ended not with a kiss misread, but with systems changed and names spoken. On the quiet evening before he would travel to speak in another city, Bernard sat on the balcony with a cup of tea. The bear rested on the railing. He wrote a short list in his notebook. Keep listening, protect spaces for confession and repair, fund the basics, hire more folks who know how to do this work. The list was practical and unromantic. That was precisely its strength. He closed the notebook and held the moment the way people hold small things when they are grateful and fatigued. He thought of the woman who had once been a nameless board figure in a room of lights and how the world had shifted, slowly, imperfectly, because she had decided to look. In the end, the unexpected kiss remained a kind of shorthand, a misread act that became a canal for change. Bernard's life had been buffeted, but it was steadier. Molly dreamed of being a teacher. Janet planned a small garden in a window box. Tyler recalibrated governance to require more human checks. Alexandra kept fighting with the board, pushing budgets and listening to workers. When the story was asked for its moral, people trying to wrap it up in one tidy sentence often missed the nuance. There was no singular lesson. There was instead a collection of practices. Show up, protect, make room, and be willing, if you have the power, to use it to lift others without seeking applause.
Bernard turned off the porch light and gathered Molly in the doorway. She yawned and reached for his hand. He tucked the bear under his arm and stepped inside. The city hummed. The program's dashboard pinged with a small update. Someone in another part of the city had just enrolled in the childcare benefit. He watched Molly sleep and thought of breath, the simple, mechanical miracle that had once been misread as something else. He thought of the way one human's action had cascaded into a series of choices that changed systems in small increments. On a kitchen table, the notarized paper lay folded in a drawer with receipts and Molly's drawings. It was an ordinary thing, that paper, and yet it traced a truth. Someone had used the power they had to restore not just a life, but a dignity. When the video sign-off came, months later, in a short, candid clip Alexandra recorded with Bernard and several pilot participants at a community center, she looked into the camera and said simply, "See someone, say their name, stand with them." The words were not polished, they were not meant to be. They were a clarion for ordinary courage. Bernard, standing beside her, nodded. He did not relish the spotlight. He accepted it because it could be used as a pulley, to lift others whose lives were as precarious as his had once been. He thought of the bear, of the mop, of the compression of hands on a rib cage and a breath that had returned life. He thought of the small, stubborn fact that one person had seen him when so many had not. And as the clip ended and the city's night deepened, Bernard held Molly's hand and whispered an answer the way parents do when the world is heavy and not yet fixed, yet moving toward repair. "We see you," he said, not to the camera, but to the small room and to the people whose names he could remember. "We see you." If this story reached you and stayed with you, like and subscribe, and take one small step. Who in your life is invisible? Say their name. Stand with them.